All right, thanks. All right, welcome back to deep learning. This is the second part of deep learning, so deep learning part 2. So here's the agenda. I'll talk about deep learning layers and architectures, and then we'll talk about transfer learning, what that means in the deep learning context, and then do some exercises. That's going to be followed by a break, and then Paul's going to talk about other deep learning topics, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end to wrap up. Okay, so let's get started here. So here are the topics I'm going to be covering the next 45 minutes, I think. So we'll start with neural network basics. So I kind of want to start out with this, talk about this diagram here. So as the diagram shows, deep learning is a subfield of machine learning, which is in turn a subfield of artificial intelligence, right? So I think if you talk to different people, you're going to get different definitions of these terms depending on their background, because lots of people come from different backgrounds who are working in deep learning now. But I think that most people would agree that the goal of artificial intelligence is to build computer systems that can perform tasks that are kind of commonly associated with what we would think of as intelligent thought, right? Or that exhibit some sort of intelligent behavior, like understanding spoken words, recognizing what's in an image, playing a game of strategy like chess or Go, right? So that's artificial intelligence. Machine learning is a subfield of that, and that focuses on systems that can learn from data. And if you were in the scalable machine learning session yesterday, we talked about the fact that it's one of the main characteristics of machine learning is that you don't have to explicitly program the model. You don't have to give it explicit step-by-step instructions on how to do a certain task. It learns from data. So the idea is that the machine learning model are data-driven, and they can discover hidden patterns and trends in the data without given explicit step-by-step instructions. Deep learning also focuses on systems that can learn from data. And the defining characteristics of deep learning models is that they have lots and lots of layers of processing units. Okay, so in general, deep learning models are based on neural networks, which are a type of machine learning model. And a neural network consists of many processing units. So what Paul went over in the previous session is, this is what's shown on the left here is a conventional neural network, right? So typically in a conventional neural network, you have an input layer and then one or two hidden layers and then an output layer. So it's considered a shallow neural network, right? So now that's kind of the term that is used to kind of distinguish conventional neural networks from deep neural networks. So a deep neural network or a deep learning model, on the other hand, can have lots and lots of layers, right? You can have dozens, even hundreds of layers. And these layers give the deep learning model the power to learn very complex mappings between the input and the output. So these layers allow for the model to learn representations of the data at different layers and different levels of abstraction, right? And so this is what gives deep learning models such a great performance, and also leads to automatic feature learning, which Paul also talked about earlier. Right, so you don't have to manually specify what features a deep learning model has to look for. It automatically figures out what features are salient to the task at hand. Okay, and also because the deep learning model has so many layers, this is why deep learning models require so much training data, because there's so many parameters that need to be adjusted. Okay, all right, so that's kind of background on deep learning and many applications in deep learning, right? The deep learning models have been applied to a lot of different tasks. So most notably, image processing, image analysis type of task, and natural language processing type of tasks like speech recognition, text summarization, name identity recognition, things like that. But deep learning models have been applied to lots of other applications as well, and they have delivered really good performance, especially compared to your conventional methods. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what a neural network is. So this is a little bit of a review, but a different take on a neural network that Paul talked about earlier. So a neural network is a machine learning model, right? And it consists of processing units that are interconnected by parameters. And in a neural network, parameters are also referred to as weights. So the neural network is trained to learn the mapping from the input to the output based on the training data that it receives, right? And the neural network, this neural network model, is inspired by biological neural systems like our brain, right? So in our brain, we have lots and lots of processing units called neurons, right? And these neurons are connected by lots of connections by dendrites and axons. And information is transmitted between these neurons, using these connections, using the dendrites and axons. And so there's also a large research area that uses neural networks, and these are at the beginning. These neural network models are referred to as artificial neural networks, or ANNs for short, right, to kind of differentiate them from biological neural networks. And there's a large research area that uses these ANNs, these neural network models, to study the processing of the human brain, right? So the inspiration for neural networks comes from the brain. And in fact, a lot of the pioneering work was done here at UCSD. So that's an interesting background. Okay, so if you take a deeper dive into each one of these processing units, right? If you look at what happens in this processing unit, you have each processing unit gets inputs, right? So the X's here are the inputs, and then the W's are the weights. These are the parameters of that processing that goes into the processing unit. So each unit computes the dot product of the inputs and the weights, right? The dot product. And then it adds a bias, and the bias is just another weight, another parameter. And then it applies an activation in order to get the output, right? So it computes a dot product, adds a bias, and applies an activation function to get the output. And then the output of each unit then is fed to units in the next layer. And normally this activation is a nonlinear activation. All right. So training a neural network consists of two phases. So this is what Paul had gone over this earlier today. So in the forward phase, the input is fed to the network. The network is multiplied by the weights, right? So each processing unit will compute the dot product, add the bias, apply an activation function to get the output. And then the output of one layer then is fed to the units of in the other layer, in the next layers, until you get to the output layer. That's what happens in the forward pass. In the backward pass, then some error is calculated at the output layer, right? So this is based on some loss function that quantifies the discrepancies between what the model is outputting and what it should be outputting, right? So the model's predictions versus the targets. And then that error then is back propagated in order to adjust all of these weights in the neural network model. Okay, so that's kind of in a nutshell what happens during neural network training. So it's an optimization problem. You're trying to adjust these weights, which are the model parameters, in order to minimize some loss function. Okay. Any questions so far? Let me check. All right. So, so let's talk about deep networks now. So this is a general architecture for a deep neural network. So you have a sequence of layers, just like in a conventional neural network. And each layer transforms its input to generate an output that gets fed to the next layer, just like in a conventional neural network. But in a deep learning model, you can have different types of layers than in a conventional neural network. So let's talk about some of the most commonly used layers in a deep learning model. So the convolutional layer is what Paul talked about earlier today. So this is the core building block for a convolutional neural network, or CNN, right? So it performs convolution operations on the input using these filters, convolutional filters. And the filter operates on just a local region, right? So it doesn't take the entire input at once. It operates on a local region, and then it slides over and convolves on the next part of the input. The filters have weights, have parameters that can be learned during training. And each filter learns to detect a feature in the input that is important for whatever task the model has to perform, right? And the output of this convolution is a feature map, right? So this animation shows the operation of the convolutional filter. So again, the filter operates on a local region, right? And it just slides over. So this is what happens in step 2. So the filter now has slid over one cell, and it does a convolution operation, and then it outputs this output here in the feature map, right? And there are parameters in the filter. So there's a filter size, which is the receptive field of the filter. So this filter is 3 by 3, and as Paul talked about before, usually people use a small filter like 3 by 3 or 5 by 5, sometimes 7 by 7. The stride is a sliding amount, right? So the number of pixels that the filter moves over the input image. Padding is a padding around the input volume. So remember when Paul talked about this, the feature map is going to be smaller because of this convolution operation. So you can add padding around the input volume so that your output can be the same size as your input. And the depth is the number of filters, right? So each filter detects a particular feature. So you usually want to have multiple filters so that you can detect multiple features in the input data. So here's another kind of a deeper dive into how the convolution operation works. So let me see. So in step 2 here, right? So the convolution, the filter is operating on this part of the image, right? So if these are the weights of the filter, and this is what is in the input, you do a dot product of this, right? So you multiply everything together, and then you get and sum them up, and you get a 3 here. So then it also gets passed through an activation function. It's not shown here just to make things, kind of keep things simple. But this dot product then will be passed through an activation function to actually come up with the output of the feature map. So that's step 2, right? And then the filter will move across the input. And then in step 9, it operates on this part of the input. And then it fills out the last part of the feature map. Okay. So that's processing of a single filter. A convolutional layer can consist of several of these filters, right? And it performs convolution on the input volume. So when you think about convolutional neural networks, it's easiest to think about the input being an image. So an image, you would have, it's a 2D grid, right? So you have the height and width of the image, and then you also have channels. So for a regular image, you would have RGB, red, green, and blue. So you would have 3 channels there. Okay, so convolutional layer performs a convolution on the input volume. Each filter in the convolutional layer is connected to a local region, right? And the result of the convolution is passed through a nonlinear activation function. And you can have multiple filters in a convolutional layer. And again, the depth is the number of filters, the number of feature maps that will be output by the convolutional layer. Okay. Okay. Another commonly used layer in a deep learning model is the pooling layer. Paul also talked a little bit about this earlier. So a pooling layer reduces the spatial size of the input, right? So, and you can have max pooling, you can have average pooling, you can have other operations as well, but most commonly the max operation is used in the pooling layer. So if you are applying a pooling layer with a filter that is 2 by 2, if you apply the filter, the pooling filter to this region of the input, the pink region, and you apply the max operation on that, then the result will be 6, right? So that is going to be the result of the pooling operation there. And then similarly on the green area, the max there is 8. And in the yellow area, the max is 3. Blue area, the max is 4. And so the pooling reduces the spatial size of the input. And pooling is performed independently on every slice of the input. So if you have this slice here, you would apply the max pooling here to get this output, right? And then you do this for every slice in your input. Okay. Another commonly used layer is a fully connected layer, and the fully connected layer is what's is used in a conventional neural network, right? So as the name implies, fully connected means every unit is connected to every unit from the previous layer. And so the output of the fully connected layer is typically a vector with probabilities for categories when you do classification. So usually it's the last layer in a convolutional neural network. And oftentimes you'll have the input to the fully connected layer is either the output of a convolutional layer or a max pooling layer, right? And the output of those layers, it would be a grid like this. So you would need to flatten it in order to have it input into a fully connected layer. Okay. Another layer that is used is a dropout layer. So what happens in a dropout layer is that processing units are randomly dropped during training. And the reason that this is done is to prevent units from co-adapting. And co-adapting means that the units are working together, right? They're working in a tandem, so they're kind of codependent, and you want to break that cycle. So this, by breaking that cycle, you can your model can be more robust. And because units are also dropped randomly, this adds noise to the training process, and this is a regularization process, right? So it's a form of regularization, and it can help to address overfitting in a deep learning model. And so overfitting prevents a model from generalizing to new data. So you want a model that does not overfit. You want a model that generalizes well. All right, so that's a dropout. Another layer is batch normalization. And this is, you can think of it as, kind of similar to how we do zero normalization or, standardization of the input, right? So you subtract the mean and divide by the standard deviation for each batch of data that you give to the model. And this increases stability in training because each layer can learn kind of independently of the previous layer because it normalizes the input that it gets. And in practice, people have found that this leads to faster conversion. So training is faster. And it also is less sensitive to the initial values of the weights. And also because it adds some noise, it also reduces overfitting and leads to better generalization. Okay, any questions so far about the layers? Okay. Right, so then let's go on to architectures. There are many, many architectures, right? I'm just going to cover some of the most commonly used ones. So we've talked about CNNs, right? Convolutional neural networks. So a CNN consists of several repeating sets of layers called blocks. And this is what we're looking at is a BGG16 network. So this is one of the earlier CNN models. And it's a very clean model. So it has several convolutional blocks, right? So each convolutional block is made up of 2 convolutional layers, right? So these are 2 convolutional layers followed by a max pooling layer, right? So remember that a max pooling layer reduces the spatial dimensions. So, you know, when you have a spatial max pooling, then the input size gets smaller, right? So that's one convolutional block. There's another convolutional block here. And then that's followed by another convolutional block that has 3 convolutional layers, right? And that's another convolutional block and another convolutional block. And then that then is followed by a fully connected layer. And then that's at the end here, you just have a softmax, which is an activation function that gives you probabilities, right? So it has, the CNN has repeating blocks. And the input volume is a tensor size of width times height times number of channels. And then the output is a vector of numbers that represent class probabilities. Okay. Let's see. So a general CNN architecture has a sequence of layers. Each layer will transform its input to generate an output through a nonlinear function. And usually you have, you know, the input image, you have convolutional blocks, you have pooling, you have several of these blocks repeated, and then that's followed by a fully connected layer. And in between, you could also have dropout layers, batch normalization layers, and you know, kind of in between these blocks, and then that's followed by a fully connected layer. Okay, here are some common, or I guess popular CNN models, and all of these have done very well on the ImageNet challenge, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about transfer learning. But these are some of the CNN models that are, you know, have done well, and you probably have heard about some of these. Okay, and CNN applications. So their success, the early success, have all been around image applications. So object classification, localization, detection, but they have also been applied to natural processing and natural language processing and other areas as well. Okay, so that's CNN. Another type of deep learning model is called an autoencoder. So in an autoencoder, the input is fed into a hidden layer, and then the output is a reconstructed version of the input, right? So the output should match the input. So the model learns to represent the input using a latent representation. It learns a latent representation of the input, and then it learns to reconstruct the input data from this latent representation. Yeah, so if you put in the input, the original input here, the autoencoder will come up with a latent representation, which is, you know, kind of an internal representation of the input, and then it learns to reconstruct the input from that latent representation. And this layer is referred to as a bottleneck layer. Okay. So the autoencoder is used for feature learning, right? Because it learns a different representation of the input, and that latent representation can be used for other downstream tasks, right? So that hidden representation can be input into you know, another classifier, another classification model, or it can be used for clustering or anomaly detection. So oftentimes it can be part of a larger deep learning model. And there are many different variations, you know, for different purposes. There's sparse, denoising, contractive, variational, and you can find lots of information about these. So for example, denoising is used to, you know, if you have input that is corrupted by noise, you can use an autoencoder to denoise the input image. Okay, another type of model is a UNet. So this is commonly used for semantic segmentation. So this is used to divide the image input the input into multiple image regions, right? So as we see here, the pixels are grouped together into what each represent. So the pixels that are colored red represent people, right? The ones that are colored green represent trees, vegetation. The purple ones represent vehicles, and then this kind of off purple color is their roads. Okay, so that's the unit is often used for segmentation. And the reason that this model is called a unit, as you can guess, is because of its architecture, right? So it has an encoding path, so you have an encoding path and then decoding path. So the encoding path is used for feature extraction. It goes to this bottleneck layer, which again is an internal representation of the input. And then in the decoder path, this internal representation is decoded into the output segmentation map. And if you notice, the encoding part of the unit is similar to a CNN, right? So it's consists of several convolutional blocks, right? So you have several convolutional layers followed by a pooling layer, and you have repeated convolutional blocks here. Okay, and units, the unit model was first used for biomedical segmentation. So if you look at a biomedical image, you want to see, what types of cells are in that image. That was kind of the first application of units, but it has been used for lots of different other different applications as well. I've used them for medical image analysis. So this is looking at a cardiac MRI, and this is a cross section of the heart. And this part is the left ventricle, which is the largest chamber of the heart, and that pumps blood out of the heart into the rest of the body. And so, the shape and the function of the LV is a good indicator of heart health. So a lot of times the first thing that people will do is to identify where the left ventricle is in a cardiac MRI. And so I've used a unit to do this. I've also used a unit to analyze silent imagery, right? Because this is also a segmentation. So for example, you want to figure out where buildings are versus where vegetation is versus where water is, for example, right? You can also use a unit for object detection for scene analysis or scene understanding. Okay. Another type of deep learning model that is commonly used is an LSTM. That stands for long short-term memory. And this is used for sequence learning, right? And it's a type of neural network called a recurrent network. So sequence learning is learning a signal that has some sort of ordering to it or some sort of time component, right? Like speech signals, it has a time component, or stock price, right? So how the price of a stock changes over the course of a day or over the course of a month. Video analysis is also another common application for sequence learning. So a recurrent neural network can model sequences and time-dependent signals. And the way they do that is to have a cyclic connection that feed previous activations back to be part of the input for the next time step, right? So that allows for temporal context information to be stored and learned by the network. Okay, so this is a diagram of the LSTM architecture. So data flows through these blocks called cells. The structure of the cell allows for the model to kind of determine what is important to remember and what can be discarded. And each cell manipulates memory through these things called gates. And it's, just a series of matrix operations to kind of regulate the input to a cell. And I think Paul's going to talk a little bit more about this later in the session. Okay, and LSTM applications have been used for, sequences, or where the input is made up of sequences. So speech recognition, excuse me, machine translation, handwriting recognition, right? So where you have to actually follow the motion when somebody writes a letter or a number. Video analysis, stock price prediction too. Excuse me. Okay, and then there's also sequence to sequence. So this is another type of deep learning model that is used for sequence learning. It's actually more of a class of network or general approach to sequence learning. So the idea is it converts an input sequence into an output sequence. And this has been used a lot for things like machine translation or question answering applications. So the idea is that if you have to translate a sentence in English into German, you can use a sequence to sequence model. So this is called an encoder, right? Because this takes the input and it comes up with some internal representation of the input sentence. And then from that internal representation, the decoder part, this is a decoder, will take that and performs a translation into, kind of essentially performs a different mapping to get the translation to a different language. The encoder and decoder are often recurrent neural networks like an LSTM, right? So people use this a lot for machine translation and question answering applications. The issue with this is that it is really difficult to capture long range dependencies because everything that is important about the input sentence has to be captured in this state. And so, if you have a long sentence, or if you have, something that is that you have to keep track of that happened at the beginning of the sentence, it's really difficult to capture those long range dependencies with a sequence to sequence model. And so to address this difficulty in capturing the long sequences, the attention mechanism was invented. So at a high level, what this attention mechanism does is that for each word, it determines the relationship between that word and every other word, right? So for each word, the attention is used to determine which other words in the sequence are important. So for example, in this sentence, right, the cat drank the milk because it was hungry. So does it refer to the cat or the milk, right? And so the attention mechanism allows you to figure out, what it refers to depending on the context, right? So in this sentence, it refers to the cat, but in this sentence, the cat drank the milk because it was sweet. It refers to milk. Right, so the attention mechanism allows you to determine the importance of the surrounding words for each word that in your sentence. Okay, so the attention mechanism improved performance of the sequence to sequence models. But then there was a very influential paper that came out, and the title of it was "Attention is All You Need." And what they showed was that a model with the attention mechanism can outperform models with recurrence. So essentially that's, attention is all you need. The attention mechanism is all you need to capture these long-term dependencies. And it only uses the attention mechanism. There's no recurrence and there's no convolution at all. And that model is called a transformer model. It's a very complex model. It has encoders and decoders as well, but there's no recurrence, there's no convolution. It just has a very complex way to capture attention. And the advantages of a transformer over, a recurrent neural network like an LSTM is that these long-range dependencies can be captured more easily using the attention mechanism. And also because of the way that the transformer is designed, you can process all the words in the sequence in parallel, right? Whereas with the LSTM, you have to process one at a time. You process one word, that the representation of that word gets fed into the next time step. And so you have to do it sequentially. So there are a couple of very important advantages of the transformer over RNNs. And so people now are mostly using transformer for, things like natural language processing and even image processing now. Another type of deep learning model is called a BERT. So this is it stands for bidirectional encoded representations for transformers. So it is a transformer, but only uses the encoding part only. And BERT is used as a language model. So it was trained on lots and lots of data, like data from Wikipedia and also a corpus called a books corpus. So it's a language model. It's just a generic language model, but it can be fine-tuned. It can be used for a lot of different natural language processing tasks like named entity recognition, relation extraction, question answering, and things like that. Okay, so a transformer, GPT is a type of transformer. It is so it's a language model. And so it can be used for what's referred to as, it can generate text. So given some prompts, it can generate some text. And it's a really huge model with a lot of parameters, like, I don't know, 100 billion weights or something like that. And it has been used for a lot of different NLP tasks. And its performance has been really, really fantastic. And so this is an article that someone wrote about the performance of GPT. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to read through this. Okay, so hopefully you've read through that. So this is kind of a review of GPT-3, and they say that GPT-3 has done a really good job of generating text, right, and things like that. Okay, so now what if I told you that this was actually written by GPT-3, right? This was not something that was it was not only written about GPT-3, but it was written by GPT-3. So this text was generated by this model. And the prompt was, it was given the author, some information about the author, the title, some tags, and a summary. I share my early experiments with OpenAI's new language prediction model, GPT-3 beta. I explain why I think GPT-3 has disruptive potential comparable to that of blockchain technology. So from that summary, GPT-3 was able to generate this text, right? These two paragraphs about this topic. And so that's pretty amazing. Okay, so some common transformer applications, a lot of NLP tasks, but also vision tasks as well, and also image captioning. So image captioning is, the input is the image, and then the output is a caption that explains the contents of the image. Okay. Another type of deep learning model that is very popular or commonly used for lots of different applications is the generative adversarial networks, or GANs. So this is an approach for generative modeling. So the model actually generates data. So it learns the structure of the input data, and it generates new data that is similar to what it was given as the input. So it consists of two models. There's a generator and a determinator, right? So it has two models, the generator and the discriminator. So the generator generates data that comes from some distribution of the input data. So in the case here of images of faces, the generator is trained to generate images with faces. The discriminator is trained to determine if the image of the face was generated by the generator or an actual image. Okay, so it determines if the input comes from the generator, which is a synthetic, right, generated data, or actual data. So that's where the name adversarial comes from, because the generator is trained to come up with more and more realistic images to fool the discriminator, and the discriminator is trained to make sure that it doesn't get fooled by the generator. So they're trained in an adversarial way. And the GAN has been used for a lot of really interesting applications. So one of the first applications, it was trained to generate realistic photographs of human faces. So, given some sort of distribution of the data, it learns to generate these images. So these are the actual outputs from that model. And the training data was of celebrity faces, which is why you see such beautiful people here in the generated images. Another application is image-to-image translation. So the task is to transform the image from one domain to another domain. So for example, the model can take a picture and turn it into a Monet-like painting, or take a picture of a horse and turn it into a zebra, or take a picture from a winter scene and turn it into a summer scene. It has also been used to create high-resolution images from low-resolution images, and that's referred to as a super-resolution GAN. So this is, so this is the original image. So they downsample the image, and then they use different methods to increase the resolution of the downsampled image. So this is using a conventional approach, using bicubic interpolation. This is using a ResNet, which is another type of neural network, convolutional neural network. And then this is using the super resolution GAN, and you can see the quality is very, very good, right? It's very close to the original image. There's a little bit of detail that is lacking here, but and here as well, but overall, it's a very good replication of the original image. Other GAN applications, text-to-image translation, face aging is really an interesting application of that as well. Okay, any questions about the deep learning architectures that we just went over? Okay, all right, so let's go on to deep learning libraries. So here are some commonly used deep learning libraries. These are Python-based deep learning libraries. TensorFlow is a framework that was developed by Google. And Keras was what Paul had used in his demos. So Keras used to be kind of a standalone package. It's a high-level API that worked on top of TensorFlow as well as other deep learning libraries as well. But now Keras is now part of TensorFlow as of, I think, 2.0, or I don't remember which version. Keras is now part of TensorFlow. There's also PyTorch, and this is a framework that is developed by Facebook. There's also a PyTorch Lightning library that is kind of equivalent to Keras. So it's a higher level API that works on top of PyTorch. And then there's also Apache MXNet. This is a framework used by AWS. And then for Java, there's Deep Learning 4J. For R, there's TensorFlow and MXNet, and lots of cloud libraries as well. So Google Cloud ML, AWS SageMaker, and others. Okay, and then there's lots and lots of resources here that I put here. This is a very good, this is a course taught at Stanford. So it has, they made their class notes available. So it has a lot of really useful information here. TensorFlow, there's a TensorFlow neural network background where you can kind of play around with the hyperparameters to see how things change. And then PyTorch tutorials. So TensorFlow and PyTorch have a lot of tutorials that you can kind of look through. Okay, I think that is what I have for this part. Any questions? Comments? Okay, so let's talk about transfer learning in the context of deep learning. Okay, so transfer learning is a method to overcome the challenges of training a model from scratch. So remember when I said that a deep learning model has lots and lots of layers, meaning that it has lots and lots of parameters. And so that means that you need a lot of data in order to adjust those parameters, right? So in a lot of applications, you may not have enough data, or it would take a very, very long time. It would take a lot of GPU cycles to train your model. And so the idea is that you can use a pre-trained model it's a model that was trained on another data set, and that will serve as a starting point for your model. And then you can train your model on your data set for your particular task. So a couple of approaches to transfer learning. So there's feature extraction and fine tuning. So in feature extraction, you remove the classification layer. So kind of, the last layer in your model. From the pre-trained model, you treat the rest as a feature extractor, and then you feed those features into a new classifier, right? So this is referred to as a top model or a classification head. There's also fine tuning. So this is, you also add your classification head or your top model, but you also tune some of the layers of the original pre-trained model as well. So those are two different approaches, and we'll in our exercises, we'll do both. Some popular architectures that have been used for transfer learning are the CNNs that I had listed before. So AlexNet, GoogleNet, VGGNet, and ResNet. So these are all winners of this image analysis competition that is referred to as ILS-VRC, which stands for ImageNet Large Scale Visual Recognition Challenge. So this is a competition on a lot of image tasks on this data that's referred to as an ImageNet data. So ImageNet is a database that was developed for computer vision research. It has about 14 million images that are hand annotated. It has about 22,000 categories. So the history of this competition is started back in 2010. And we're going to be focusing mostly on the image classification task. And that has 1,000 object categories. And if you take a look at the error rate over the years, back in 2010, when this competition started, the error rate was about 28%. And this was using conventional image processing techniques, right? Huff transform, edge detectors, things like that. Then in 2012, AlexNet was the first CNN that entered this competition. And that nearly halved the error rate, right? So it brought it from 28% down to 15%. And then ever since then, the error rate has been, going lower and lower and decreasing more and more. So in 2015, ResNet achieved an error rate of about 3.5, and this was better than human performance. So they trained somebody, a human, to do this image classification task, and that person, or ResNet, did better than that person. And then now, it's getting down to, kind of the 2% error here, and this might be just down to the noise level. So it's just been getting better and better. And ever since AlexNet, all of the entries are now deep learning models. So here's another look at that classification results. You can see that the error goes down and down. Okay, so the idea behind transfer learning is, remember that a deep learning model has lots and lots of layers, right? And the higher up you go, so sorry, this is kind of the opposite. So the higher up you go, the more abstract the layers become, the features that are learned become. And so the idea is that the lower layers of the model detect kind of generic features in an image. So, edges, curves, different colors and things like that. So those are things that are common in all images, right? That you need to extract in order to understand higher level features. And so what you can do, the idea then is that you can use the lower layers as is, right? So on a network that has been trained on ImageNet, you can keep these lower layers as is because these layers detect features that are important in any image, and then fine tune the rest of the layers to customize to your own data set. Okay, so that's the idea behind transfer learning. So if we take this pre-trained model, this is a VGG. Feature extraction then means that you would extract the feature here, right? So you don't change any of this. The only thing that you're doing is you're replacing this with your own classifier. So this is used as a feature extractor. You're extracting features here. You take these features and feed it into your own classifier trained on your data set for your particular task. Fine tuning is you replace this classification head or the top model here for your particular task, and you adjust those parameters as well as some of the layers, usually the higher layers in the pre-trained model. Okay. So a couple of tips on when and how to fine tune. So if the new data set is small and similar to your original data set, then you can just do feature extraction, right? Extract the features from the higher layer and feed it to a separate classifier. If the new data set is large and similar to the original data set, then you can fine tune for the top part of all layers because now you have more data. If the new data set is small and different from the original data set, then you might want to go a little bit lower because then you have to kind of, train lower layers as well. If the new data set is large and different from the original data set, then you can, again, fine tune just either the top layer or all layers. Some other tips. When you do transfer learning, you want to use a very small learning rate for the fine tuning part because you don't want to destroy what was already learned. The other is that you want to train your top level classifier first, right? So that's the one that is customized for your particular task to your data. So you want to train that first and then you fine tune the lower layers. Otherwise, you can mess up what was already learned by the pre-trained model. You might also want to do data augmentation, and we'll talk a little more about that when we do the exercise. So this is a way to add variation and also increase the size of your training set. So you can add things like horizontal flips, vertical flips, random crops, translation, rotation, kind of simple image processing operations to slightly alter your image. And so that will add variation to your data, and it will also increase the size of your data set. Okay, so now we're going to do a couple of hands-on. So the data that we're using is a subset of the cats and dogs images from a Kaggle competition, and we'll do both feature extraction and fine-tuning. Right, so the data, we have 1,000 images of cats and 1,000 images of dogs, and then a couple hundred for validation, and a couple for test. So these are just images of cats and dogs, right? So kind of images that people will take of their pets. So the feature extraction, for feature extraction, we're going to set the image dimensions and location, and then we're going to do use what's called a image data generator to read images from a folder, right? So when you dealing with a lot of data, you don't want to read everything all in at once. A lot of times you can't. So you want to read just a batch at a time from your file system. And then for the model building, we're going to load the model. We're going to load the pre-trained weights. We're going to freeze the weights in the pre-trained model, right? Because we're only using this as a feature extractor. Then we're going to add the top model to classify cats versus dogs. And then we're going to compile the model so that we're combining the pre-trained base model plus our top model classifier. When we train the model, we're only training the top model weights. And then we'll do your normal evaluation, calculate accuracy, et cetera, and then performance inference on some test images. Okay. For fine tuning, kind of the same thing. The difference here is that when we're training the model, we want to use the model weights that we got from feature extraction. And then we are going to adjust some of the layers in the pre-trained model as well. And we're going to use a validation data to determine when to stop training, right? So we're going to use early stopping to determine when to stop training. And then evaluation the same way. So this kind of explains how early stopping works. So the idea is that we're going to use a validation data to determine when to stop the training in order to avoid overfitting. So remember that when a model overfits, it doesn't generalize well to new data. So we want to prevent overfitting. So the idea is that we are going to monitor the error on the validation set, and when the validation error starts to increase, this is when the model is overfitting. And so we want to stop training right here and save these weights. And these are the weights that we want to use for the final model. Okay, and this explains data augmentation, right? So it's adding random image operations, image manipulation operations to your image. So this is your original image. You can add random rotation. You can add random zoom. You can also add, this is flipping. This is horizontal flipping. Okay. This adds variability to your data set. It also increases the size of your data set. Okay. Okay, so the pre-trained model that we are going to use is called the MobileNet version 2. So it also has convolutional blocks. They're much more complicated than the VGD. But essentially, this is kind of what it looks like. It has an expansion layer, depth-wise layer. So it has, different types of layers as well. It is a CNN. It is a lightweight architecture, and it was designed for mobile devices, which is why it's called the MobileNet. Okay. All right. So let's get going on this. So yeah, so you should have a terminal on your local machine so that you can log into Expanse, and then do a git pull so you can get the latest material. All right, and then in your terminal window, okay, so that should be, yes, in your terminal window, type in Jupyter GPU shared TensorFlow. So the PDF for this slide is also available in the repo, so you can go ahead and download this and copy and paste this if you'd like. I can also put this in here. So GPU shared TensorFlow. So if you type that in, that is an alias for this very, very long command here. When you type that in, you should get a URL, so you can copy and paste that into your browser. Okay. Let me know when you have done that and we can continue on. And I'm going to also see if I can share my Jupyter Lab as well. I'm going to stop sharing, I think, and so I can share both windows. All right, let me stop sharing. Stop sharing. Jupyter Lab. This, I think. Oh. Okay, so you should see now both windows. Okay. All right, so once you have your Jupyter Lab up and running, in the terminal window in Jupyter Lab, so you want to open up a terminal window here, and you want to go to your local Scratch, right? So cd Scratch /user. Oh, there's a missing slash here, so it should be Scratch /user. All right, so you should be in your Scratch, local Scratch. So it should look something like this. Okay, is anybody not there? Okay, let me, give me a thumbs up if you are here at this point. Awesome, thank you. All right. Okay, so then we're going to copy the data over, the cats and dogs data. And again, you can copy and paste this, and I can also put it in the chat, Slack. So do that. And you can do copy SI22 data dir cats versus dogs.zip and period. Don't forget this period. So it's this command. And then you do an unzip. You want to do a -q, otherwise it's going to spew out a lot of stuff. Okay, and then you unzip that file. And then you can do an ls cats and dogs, and you should see test, train, and validation. Okay. Anybody need help? Anybody stuck? Okay. Hopefully everybody's there. Okay, so the code. So if you go to your home directory, go into wherever, you know, the SDSE clone, the repo clone, and then go to 5.2b, deep learning, and then go under transfer learning. And yeah, we have time. We can open up feature extract, not the solution one, the I think I don't need to. Yeah, so I'm going to get rid of this. Joe, I think. Can I do that? Do you see just one window now? just my Jupyter Lab?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic, thanks. So that gives me a little bit more room to kind of move things around a little bit here. All right, so hopefully everybody's there. We're gonna kind of go through this together. I think it's probably better to do it together. Okay. Zoom windows keep moving. All right. Okay, hopefully everybody's got this up. All right. Where are we here? Okay, so again, this is going to be we're going to be doing transfer learning. We're going to use a pre-trained model, which is the MobileNet V2, and this is using it as a feature extractor. So we're going to freeze the weights in the pre-trained model, add our top model, and then train it on the cats and dogs data. Okay, so we can just go through here. So this is just importing a bunch of libraries. This is looking at what version of TensorFlow we're using and also Python version we're using. This is looking at, what is the device that we're using. So we are using a GPU, and by default, it's going to use the first GPU. And then this is the NVIDIA SMI command. So this will tell you what is running on the GPU. So currently nothing is running on there right now. As it's running, we can also go to the terminal window and issue this command to see how much memory is being used. Okay, this is just to set the logging level so that we don't get a bunch of messages. This is setting some random generator seeds so that we can get somewhat reproducible results. The thing to note about GPU is that it's really difficult to get exactly the same results because of all the optimization that happens within the GPU every time it runs something. But we're trying to set it so that we can reproduce the results as much as possible. Okay, so here is where we are setting the image location and dimension. So if you're following along, hopefully you are. This is where, okay, so we're setting some, we're getting some environmental variables, right? So that we can get to where that the data is that we just copied. Okay, so now we want to set the data path here. So if you are following along, you can put in data path equals, what did we say? So it's scratch user, right? So you have to put in scratch slash. So user, we have set it up here. And then it is job underscore. And then Slurm job ID, we set it up here. And then it's going to be cats and dogs, right? Slash cats versus dogs. All right, so hopefully that works. Okay, so this is our location of our data. So under there, so remember when we did this, when we did an LS here, we have 3 subdirectories. There's one for tests, there's one for train, and there's one for validation, right? So we've set the path to each one of those. Okay. Is this okay? Am I going too fast or everything's okay? Kind of hard to tell. Thumbs up if everybody's okay. Okay.
I think the path setup has some error, like
Your path, are you getting an error?
No, I'm looking at yours. path. Is it right? The train path, I think the forward
Um,
slash is missing, and then
in my slide?
yeah, no,
Yeah,
in
it
your
is missing. Sorry. Yes, it is missing. In the slide, it is missing. So yeah, here it's missing. There should be a slash after scratch. Okay, so let's see, where are we now? So, okay, so now we're down here. So we need to set the image dimension. We want to set image width and image height. So image width equals 224, and image height is also equals 224. Okay. And I just scroll up a little bit here. All right, so here's where we are looking at the preparing the data. So we want to set the batch size. The batch size is how many images do we use at a time to do that forward and backward pass to train the model. So in our case, let's use batch size for 16. Let me try to make this a little bit bigger. Is the font okay on the Jupyter Lab, or do I need to make it bigger?
It looks fine to me.
Okay, thank you. Let me try to make it. Okay, so set the batch size. So this is where the batch size comes in, right? So this is saying, okay, so we're just setting the, we're just setting up the image generators. And so what you notice here is that in the, for the train data generator, we're going to add data augmentation, right? We're going to do add shear, zoom, horizontal flip. And then there's also this pre-processing. So this pre-processing is set to pre-process the data the same way that it was pre-processed for the mobile net v2. Okay, so we need to do that same processing for train, validation, and test. Only for the train do we do the data augmentation, right? Because you don't, I mean, that is only relevant for training. Usually. So, and then, so that's setting up the data generators. And then this is setting up where to read the data, right? So we're using a flow from directory. That means that it's going to read a batch of images at a time. So we're giving it the training data directory, which we set up here. Okay. And we are also setting the target size, which we set here. We are setting the batch size, which now we have to set here. So where you see your code here, put in batch size, and batch size is going to be all caps. Yep. All caps. Batch underscore size, and we're going to use a 16, batch of 16. And class mode is binary because we only have two categories, right? Cats and dogs. Shuffle is are the images shuffled. So you know, you want to shuffle them, or do you just want to use the same order that you read them in? So for training, usually it's a good idea to shuffle them. And then we're also setting a random seed here so that we can reproduce results as much as possible. Okay, then all right, so then we also have a validation generator, which is similar. The only difference is, again, there's no data augmentation, right, for the validation generator. Okay, so now we also need to set up the test data generator. So it's going to be very similar to the validation generator. So you can kind of copy and paste that and then make the necessary changes. Okay, so now we want to call this test generator. And we are going to use the test data gen. We are reading from the test data directory. Target size is the same. Batch size is the same. Class mode is the same. We're also doing shuffle is false, and we actually don't really need this seed, but we can just leave it there. Okay. All right. So if we run this, we should get, if everything's set up correctly, we should get the number of images in each class. And there's something wrong. Did I spell something wrong? Oh, I see. Oh, okay, I spelled this wrong. Job. I'm missing a slash. Okay. So if you've set up everything correctly, you should get this. Found 2,000 images belonging to 2 classes, found 400 images belonging to 2 classes. This is validation, and then this is test. Okay. Okay. All right. Load pre-trained model. So here we are loading the base model, right? So we're loading the mobile net v2, the weights that were trained on the ImageNet data. Include top is false because we don't want that classification layer, because ImageNet has 1,000 categories. We're going to add our own top model for our cats and dogs data. This is freezing the weights of the pre-trained model, right? So trainable is false. This we also need to set because of the batch normalization layer, and it gets a little bit complicated, but it's just the way that the batch normalization layer behaves during inference mode, and you can read more about that here. Okay, so now we want to look at the architecture. So we can do base model.summary. Okay, so this is the model. It's a pretty complicated model, lots and lots of layers. But you can see, it has different blocks, and within each block, there are different layers. Okay, so at the end here, you're going to see the total number of parameters, the total number of trainable parameters. So we're not training any of the models in the base model, so we're not adjusting any of those. So those are all frozen, right? Okay, so now here's where we create our top model. So we're going to put this on top of the pre-trained model, and this is going to be customized for our dogs and cats data. So this is setting the input layer, right? So we're adding that on top of the base model. We are adding a layer called a global average pooling. So it's kind of like pooling, except that it operates on the entire input instead of just a patch at a time. We're adding a dropout layer with the probability of dropping units at 20%. We're adding a fully connected layer with the sigmoid activation, and that's going to be our model. All right, so now let's take a look at what the model looks like now after we have added our model. So here's the input layer, here's the pre-trained model, here's our average pooling model layer, here's dropout, here's a fully connected layer. So now we have this many parameters, and these are the ones that are in the top layer. So it comes from the fully connected layer. So these are the only ones that we're adjusting during training. Okay. All right. And now let's train the model. So this is compiling the model. So this is just creating the graph computation graph, the graph computation at the end, or in the background. So we are using the Atom optimizer with this learning rate, and we are using the loss function that we're using is binary cross entropy, and the metric that we are monitoring is accuracy. Okay, so compile that. So now let's train. Let's train it for, we need to set the number of epochs. So let's just train it for 5 epochs here. So here, let's just train it for 5 epochs, and then we'll see the loss and the accuracy will get output as we train. Okay, so this is the loss and the accuracy on the training data. And then at the end of the epoch, it's going to also output the loss and accuracy for the validation data. Okay, so that's the end of the first epoch. So this is the loss, accuracy on the training data, validation loss, and validation accuracy. And we're doing this for 5 epochs. So this is, it's going pretty fast because we're only training about 1,000 weights here. Okay. I guess I need to kind of hurry along here. Okay, it's going to go. So you can see that the loss is decreasing, accuracy is increasing. Accuracy on the validation data is also increasing. Okay, so this is the end of the 4th epoch. And we're going to go for another epoch here. This will probably take about a couple of minutes to train. So maybe another, it's finishing up here. Okay, so that took about 1.5 minutes. Accuracy went up, which is good, which is what we want. Okay, so now we want to save the weights. You can do that using model.save. So model.save, and then you can give it a name. So I like to keep my models in a separate directory from my code. So I'm going to put it in a separate directory, and then I'll call this model features model. Okay. And it's going to save the models there. And then I'm going to plot the loss curves. This warning error is because config. Yeah, I'm actually not certain. Oh, I think it's because it has to do with the actually the mobile net v2. There's some configuration that I think is kind of old. So I think this is what this warning is. Okay, so now we're plotting the validation and train of validation. So this is loss, and this is accuracy. So you can see that the accuracy is going up here. Okay, so then let's do evaluation and inference. So this is getting the train data accuracy. You can do that using model evaluate. So this is getting the train data accuracy. Now we can, we also want to get the test accuracy here. So you want to copy and paste that and just change everything to test. Train generator and test data accuracy. All right, let's see what we're getting here. All right, so now it's passing all of the trained data through the trained model, and similarly with the test data. And see what we're getting here. Train data accuracy is 967, and test accuracy is 977. So we're actually doing better on the test data than we are doing on the train data, which does happen sometimes. Usually it's the other way around, but it does happen. And so with this part here, what the model outputs is a probability. So in order to compute things like precision and accuracy and things like that, we need to threshold the model predictions to make it into a binary quantity to compare it to the labels. And so this is what is happening here. And then we can use the classification report, which is a scikit-learn method, to get our results. So what we're getting here is, this is on the test data, right? This is on the test data. So we're getting an accuracy of 9775. Okay. What does, oh, you're talking about this here? So this is, this returns both loss and accuracy. And since we're only concerned about the accuracy, we don't need to save the loss. So this is just, kind of a throwaway variable because we're not storing it, in a separate variable. Okay, great. Okay, so now let's perform some inference on some test images. So this is a method that we're defining to load an image, to do some scaling of the image, and this is just some data manipulation to make it the dimensions right. So this is a method. We're going to look at this cat image. So the model outputs a probability of 0.12 for this image. So 0 is cat and 1 is dog, right? So the smaller the number, the more certain the model is that it's a cat. The larger the number, the more certain that it is a dog, right? So in this image, it's pretty certain that it's a cat, right? So let's look at a dog image. So in this one, the probability is 0.95. So it's pretty certain that this is a dog. All right, so let's look at other test images. So I think we can just copy and paste. So this is loading. Yeah, so this is loading. Let's see what this image is. So this is a cat. And this one is actually misclassified, right? Because the threshold is 0.5. So it thinks that this is a dog. So this has a probability of about 0.6. So this actually thinks it's a dog. And then let's do this one here. All right, this is a dog. Oh, and this one is actually misclassified, right? This is a dog, but it's misclassified. But note that these two that is misclassified is kind of borderline, right? It's very close to 0.5. And this, I guess, kind of looks like a cat because, of the kind of the face is really kind of look more like a cat. Okay, and then perform inference on here. So let's do this one. Let's see what this one does. And then we have to change this to 1311. And this is a dog. But it also is not very certain about this. This is a dog. It does correctly classify it, but it's very close to 0.5 as well. And as you can see, it's kind of blurry, right? The dog is behind the fence. And so it's a little bit difficult to see. Okay, so anyway, so this is for feature extraction. So let's try to look at fine tuning as well, given the amount of time that we have left. So it's important to restart the kernel here before, and that will kind of free up, it kind of cleans the GPU cache and, kind of purges everything on the GPU memory. If you don't do that and you try to run another notebook like the fine-tune notebook, you're going to get an out-of-memory error, or you could get an out-of-memory error. So let's look at the fine-tuning. So given the amount of time, I think I'm gonna look at the solution and just kind of walk you through that. All right, so for fine tuning, what we're doing here, so we're gonna just run through the setup part. I'm gonna clear all outputs first. All right. All right, so all this is kind of the setup. It's the same as the feature extraction. Setting the image locations and everything is the same. Preparing data is the same. So here's where it's different. So now we are loading the model that we trained from feature extraction, right? So remember that we saved it here. So we're gonna load that model. This is, if you're running this notebook on your own time, you can uncomment this to see all the layers. So it prints out a lot of information because this is a pretty complicated model. But if you're interested in that, you can do that. Okay, so here's where we are freezing some of the weights, but leaving the ones in the higher layers unfrozen so that we can train those, right? So now we have a lot more parameters to train. So before, with feature extraction, we had, let's see, what was it at the end here? Before, we were training just the top model feature the top model weight. So we only had about 1,000 parameters to train. Here we are also fine tuning some of the weights in the pre-trained model. So now we have 1.5 million parameters to train, right? Okay, so now we're going to fine tune, and this is going to take longer because we are tuning a lot more parameters, right? And also we are doing early stopping here, right? So we are monitoring the loss on the validation data set, and we are setting, these are parameters for early stopping. So patients of 3 and minimum delta of 0.01, meaning that if the validation loss has not changed by this much for 3 epochs, then stop training. Okay, so we are training this, we're giving it 20 epochs, but we're doing early stopping, so it could stop before then. All right, so this is going to take a little while to run. Let me see, anything else I can walk you through. So after that, we are going to load the best weights from early stopping. We're going to save the weights, and we're going to plot the loss and the accuracy curves as before. And we're also going to do, evaluate on the trained data, the test data, and also get the classification report, and then do inference on some test images. Okay, so let's see how this is doing. Okay, any questions that I can answer while we're waiting for this? I think this takes about 10 epochs to run through. So got a few minutes here. And if you can also test this on a CPU, and you can see that it's much, much slower on a CPU. So just for fun, you can do that, later on your own time. Okay, so I think it's getting close to the end here. And you can see that, see the loss on the training data is decreasing, but the loss on the validation set, so it decreases. Okay, it still decreases, but it's kind of leveling off here now. So it's kind of fluctuating at this point now. So I think it's going to stop pretty soon here. Because remember, early stopping, we're monitoring the validation loss, right? Okay. Where did 116 for fine tune? Okay, so 116, we are freezing all the weights up until layer, I think there are 17 convolution blocks in the MobileNet v2, and we are stopping at convolution of 14. So that's kind of, where the top layers start. So that's another hyperparameter, right? So there's not a hard and fast rule to say when you should stop, when you should start fine tuning. Okay, so it stopped training, right? That took about 3 minutes. So let's run the rest of this and see what happens here. So this is loading the model, loading the weights from the loading the weights of the best model from early stopping, saving the weights, and then we are going to plot the loss curves, loss and accuracy curves, and loss accuracy curve. So we can see that let's see, the loss goes down and then it kind of flattens out, it kind of fluctuates around here. And so that's when early stopping kicks in, right? Because we actually set it for 20 epochs, but it's only trained up until epoch 8 here, the 9th epoch, as it starts at 0. Okay, so this is the train and validation accuracy and classification report. So let's see how we do after training. So feature extraction, we did, what did we do? So we got, on the test data, we got 9775. And here we are actually doing a little bit worse. So 9875. So in this case, fine tuning did not help. But this is a very small data set. If we use a larger data set, we could get slightly different results. Okay, so now let's do performance on test data, on individual test data. So this is the cat image that we saw before. So the model now is very, very confident that this is a cat, right? So compared to, so this is 0.025 compared to 0.122. This dog was 0.958. So let's see how it does here. So this also did better, right? So it's a very confident, this is a cat, very confident this is a dog. All right, let me just kind of go through these quickly because we're out of time here. So I thought some of these are really interesting. So this one actually got worse, right? Because now it misclassifies this one. It correctly classifies this one. It still misclassifies this one. This one I thought was really interesting because it's upside down, and maybe the data augmentation helped here. This one I thought was really difficult even for me to figure out, right? But it did a pretty good job. This one it's able to do a really good job even though you don't see the face at all. This one is kind of iffy, so it thinks that it is a dog. And I think this is a dog. To me, that looks like a dog, so that might be okay there. And then this one is really interesting as well because this is a picture. This is a drawing of a dog, and it does a really good job of classifying that. Okay, so I think we are at the end here. I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions in the last couple of minutes here. And all of this, these notebooks are in the repo, so you can download them and look at them more closely later if you'd like. Okay, any questions? All right, well, if you don't have any questions, so thanks for attending this session, and I hope you found it to be useful.
Okay, so for this last session, I wanted to get to something, to try to build some intuition about what happens with more complicated models. So I'm going to look at this idea of skip connections and the Keras model API functions. So here's my outline. I'm gonna talk a little bit about gate connection, the gate connection idea, then skip and residual connections. And then we'll look at the Keras model API, which is different than the sequential function that we were using before. So for more complicated models, there's another way to program it, and that's what we'll do in the exercise. And we'll look at an auto-encoding example with MNIST, and we'll add skip connections. All right, so let's start with this. This was a slide I had before, the logistic unit. Remember I said, this is a function that defines our activation. We can draw it out as a little bit as a kind of graph. We have these parameters that shift around this function. And I gave you an example before where I said, imagine you have one input. This input feeds into two different units, and these units have some parameters in their activation function. It's using a sigmoid, and they have this kind of shape, and we can add it together, and we get this bump function as the output. So we can build this nonlinear transformation of the input. Now imagine I have this situation. I have two inputs. I call them x1, x2, two units. They each have some different parameters, so they have different activation shapes. It's to say, so again, these are logistic functions. And instead of adding these together, what if I do this? What if I say I'm going to multiply them together? What is the output function doing in this case? All right, so just look at that for a second, and in your head, see if you can come up with a description, formal or informal, of what that function, output function, is going to represent. And if you've seen this kind of stuff before, if you have maybe an engineering background, you are familiar with what step functions are, and you can see that the x1 activation is almost like a step function. And that step function, in a sense, can act like a gate, because if x1 is less than 0, it's going to be 0 when you multiply it out with x2. It's just going to 0 everything out. If x1 is greater than 0, it's going to be 1. And so then the activation is just going to be based on just x2. So here x1 acts kind of like a gate. And so we can take this idea and apply it. And this was applied in recurrent neural networks. So I'll remind you what something Mai said before. With a recurrent neural network, we create this cyclic connection. So you have an input, and you store the previous output, and that becomes another input to the hidden unit. And then you multiply those together, you pass them through your activation function. I'm sorry, you don't multiply them together, you add them together, you pass it through your whatever activation function you use, and you could get another output. Well, we can rework this in the following way. We could take our previous output, our current input, feed it into a logistic unit, take the output of that logistic unit as a gate value. We multiply it by the previous output, and now we're using our information about the state of the network and the current input as a gate. We're going to apply that gate to the previous output. We're going to take 1 minus the gate, apply it to the current input. And so now you have this weighted probability, right? It's either our weight applied to the previous output, 1 minus our weight applied to the current input, and so we're creating a gating mechanism. And this is what comprises the main part of a gated recurrent unit. It's a little simpler version of the long short-term memory gated unit that Mai was showing. It comes out of this paper, and there's a couple more parts to it, but which I don't really need to get into. But hopefully that just gives you a sense of like what motivated the gate. But once you have an idea that, oh, I can gate things, you can apply it anywhere. So here's an example where I have some input, and I'm going to run it through a hidden layer, and I have maybe the same input or maybe different input. I'm going to also run it through another hidden layer. So I have a hidden layer H, a hidden layer G, and instead of just taking these further to another layer, I can actually make a gate out of this. So imagine I take my G layer, I'm going to multiply it element-wise by the H layer. But before I do that, I'm going to take a softmax activation at the G layer. And remember, when we're doing categorization, we use softmax because softmax normalizes your outputs into basically probability weights or probability values. So this is what we use when we're doing classification. But here I'm doing it just to make a weight, a probability weights, and I'm going to actually apply it inside the layer. So I could do this and then have more layers further on down. So I could stick this anywhere in my network. And in fact, in the attention mechanism that Mai was talking about, there is a layer in there that is doing just that. It's actually using a softmax to produce what is essentially a kind of probability weighting or a kind of a gate against some other set of input. So I'm not going to go through the details of this. I'm just giving you a quick, hopefully some intuition that in the attention mechanism, if you're doing something like language translation, you might have English words, French words, you're trying to do these long distance or potentially long distance matching between your one sequence and another sequence. So if you remember the example Mai was showing, every word kind of gets matched against every other possible word in your sequences. There and in the attention mechanism, there's a softmax to hopefully choose or gate which thing you should be paying attention to. And that's hopefully that's the terminology people use. That's kind of the hopefully builds some intuition about what these things are doing, what that kind of thing is doing. All right, so that's a gating idea. Let's look at skip connections and residual connections. Here's other kinds of connections. So let's start for this. Let's think again about the multi-layer perceptron. We take our input, pass it through a hidden layer, and pass it to an output layer. But what if we say, you know what, the input has a lot of information that I would like to present to the output layer directly. How can I carry that input forward? Well, a simple way is to just make this extra connection where I'm taking the input layer, I'm going to carry it forward directly to the output layer. And so this is not a hidden layer. This is just a copy. And in order to present it to the output layer, I'm going to do a concatenation. I'm going to concatenate the hidden layer and the input. So now I have a bigger vector, and I'm going to pass that to the output layer. And if I do this, the output layer now has, in some sense, they're direct access to the input layer. So whatever features are in the input layer are used more efficiently and presented directly to the output layer. So one of the ideas behind the skip connection is that we can reuse features or make the features used more efficiently because we're going to present them directly to whatever next part of the network is there. And in fact, this doesn't actually have to happen for just input to output. It could happen at any layer, and you could skip ahead any other number of layers and present and skip present that output. So in this picture, I could take the output from my first hidden layer and just skip it forward a couple layers. Why not? There's nothing stopping you from doing that. Presumably, if you do this kind of thing, you would have some intuition for doing that kind of thing. Okay. And in fact, the UNet architecture that Mai mentioned does use this kind of connections. So let's talk a little bit about this situation. Remember, when we were doing MNIST classification, we had this, we had these convolution layers, and as we processed the input, we were using convolution and max pooling. We were downsampling the input-output maps, and we were increasing the number of features. And that's the kind of standard thing you might do with classification. So you're going to so in this example, we had a 28 by 28 image. We're downsampling to 14 by 14, but we're increasing the number of filters. And at some point, you get a little bottleneck. At some point, you don't want to go down to anything lower than, let's say, 7 by 7. So in this bottleneck layer, I have 7 by 7 maps but I have 256 of them. So this is kind of an encoding part of your network. And when we did classification, we just added some classification layers. But what if instead of classification, we want to do something like reconstruction? We're going to reconstruct the input. What could we do? So it turns out a good way to do this is to reverse the encoding into some decoding, and that requires some upsampling. So in other words, from the bottleneck that was 7 by 7, which presumably, you know, the good thing about a bottleneck is you've processed the input and you're only saving the most pertinent information. So the bottleneck forces you to do that. It creates kind of a latent representation, which is what Mai talked about. And when we upsample, but if we want to reconstruct the original input, then when we upsample, we need to increase the size of these maps. So in this example, our 7 by 7 bottleneck maps are upsampled into 14 by 14. I change the number of filters from 256 to 128, and then I do another upsampling and another change in the number of filters to 64. And finally, I have a last convolution layer that's basically taking my last convolution, my upsampling block here, and producing a 28 by 28 image. Okay, we'll see how that works. So that's what we're going to look at in the exercise. But one thing that people have found is if you want to do something like reconstruction, it's really helpful to have skip connections. So in a skip connection, I'm taking my convolution output from my first convolution block and maybe my second convolution block, and I'm just directly passing it ahead to the blocks on the decoding side. And you will have to be careful because you want to make sure that if you're going to do a concatenation, that your input matches the size, the shape, the image height and width onto where you're skipping ahead. Okay. So your 28 by 28 encoded maps have to be skipped ahead to where the 28 by 28 decoding maps are. And you got to make sure you're concatenating it on the right axis, right? So in this example, I have 28 by 28 by 64. I want to concatenate that to 28 by 28 by 64. And you want to end up with basically 28 by 28 by 128. All right, so hopefully that gives you an idea of what kind of things skip connections are good for. Again, this is what the UNet architecture looks like. There's these convolution blocks and skip connections that help process, help reuse some of those features that were represented in the convolution encoding blocks. All right, skip connections. So they come up. What about residual connections? This is a more, I think, a slightly unintuitive kind of idea. All right, so I'm gonna try it. So imagine I give you this situation where I have an input layer, some number of hidden layers, and an output layer. All right, so I got some deep network and it learns, a certain amount. And I think, gee, maybe I should add more hidden layers. If I add more hidden layers to a deep network, I'm creating a little bit harder situation for the network to learn, right? We talked about the vanishing gradient problem. Now you have information that you need to propagate all the way back. Should I add another layer? I mean, it's more expensive, but maybe another layer can give you another, transformation, another deep learning feature discovery kind of thing. So it's a slightly, we have this goal that we think intuitively it's good to have more layers, but the more layers you have, the harder, more computation it is, the harder maybe it is to learn to find good representations. Maybe you're overfitting, for example. Okay. So you don't really know if the next layer, let's say the next layer might be unnecessary. Well, if it turns out that the next layer is unnecessary, then it might be nice if the network just kind of ignored it, just didn't really perform any nonlinear transformation, if it just created an identity function from H1 to H2. So if H2 was the same as H1, then you're not going to do any worse. So hopefully that's kind of the intuition behind what is the residual network, residual connection, I should say. it goes something like this. You take your H1 output and you're going to skip it ahead to the next layer. But instead of presenting it as a concatenation or presenting it as a multiplication, you're just going to add it into the output from the next layer. So my f of x that is going to be presented to the next layer is equal to h2 plus h1. And that means that the h2 is really the same as f minus h1. And so in this sense, h2, if h2 is going to do anything useful, it's kind of like a residual. It's a residual of what got presented to, it's learning the residual of what got presented to the next layer when you take out the previous layer. So this is a skip ahead connection with an element-wise addition. And it works when, it works most easily when you have the same size output for your hidden layers. All right, so this is a residual connection. This came up in what's called the ResNet. The ResNet, did really well in the image, one of the more recent image, I guess it's 2019, I want to say, image competitions. The authors show that, having this kind of connection really helps you add more deep layers. And so the intuition behind it is that it makes it easy for a network to carry forward, representations that are useful and to add more layers without making anything worse. And so if you're going to learn something, it's going to learn something useful. Okay. All right. So here's a summary of what these connections were. So I had the softmax for gating. Comes up in like recurrent networks, these transformer nets, and the idea of a gate. You can really use that in a lot of places in principle. Skip connections, the intuition behind it is that it's good for feature reuse. It comes up in UNets. You can use it in feed-forward networks. It doesn't have to just be image processing problems. Residual connections, the idea that it's going to help deeper learning. And so this comes into the ResNet models. And so in that example, it's important for large image classification. All right, so these are three different kinds of connections and the intuitions behind them. And now let's look at the Keras model API, because we need to think about, if we're going to implement these kinds of things, we need to use this more flexible functions. All right, so you might remember that when we first did MNIST earlier, we presented a simple example. It looks something like this, that using the sequential function in Keras, there's a Keras module, the models functions, and one of those model functions is the sequential function. And my simple example of MNIST was to flatten the input and have some dense layers. Okay. And in this example, everything is presented in sequence, and Keras can figure out what the inputs and outputs are just by the fact that it's presented in sequence. But there's another way to do this. You can set up, instead of having a sequential model, you have just a sequence of functions. And here, okay, I'm going to go through these one at a time. My first function is an input function. I say, here's my input. It's all part of the layers API. So I have an input function and I give it a shape. And then I say, I'm going to have a flatten function. And I have a flatten function, and then you tell it what the inputs are in separate parentheses here. So inputs feeds the flatten function. Then I have a hidden layer. The hidden layer, just a dense activation is ReLU, and I tell it what the inputs are going to be. The inputs is going to be inputs flattened. The output layer is going to use inputs from the hidden layer. So you create these functions, and then you have a model statement. The model statement says, okay, Keras, build a model. start with these inputs, end with this output layer. And then Keras will go figure out what's connected to what by working backwards and figuring out for each function where its input is going to come from. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of it's a little bit, I think, if depending on how much Python you've done, maybe it's not intuitive, but if you see it enough times, I think it'll make sense. Okay, but the nice thing about this is when you have, let's say, two different paths, or maybe you have skip connections, or you have, other kinds of architectural things you want to do, you can program that through, these kind of functions. So the model API, with the model API with a capital M. Sometimes it's called the functional API. Okay. All right. So let's go to an MNIST autoencoding exercise. And we're going to look at MNIST autoencoding and then add skip connections. So hopefully you are still logged in to a notebook or Jupyter Lab. Whoops, hang on. Okay, so if you were logged into the Jupyter Lab that you were using with my, you want to make sure I believe you have to shut down the kernels or restart the kernel. Maybe you want to close off what was in there. Close those particular notebooks. I also opened up a new Jupyter notebook, or Jupyter Lab, I should say. And I did this with there's an alias called Jupyter Compute TensorFlow, which opens up just a compute node. So you could either use a compute node for this exercise or a GPU node for this exercise. If you're using the GPU node that you had before, make sure you shut down the kernels. I'm going to go into the compute node version, or the compute node session that I have. And I'm going to go into, if you hopefully have pulled down a repo today, or probably yesterday. I don't think I updated it, so I think it was there yesterday. You can go into the Summer Institute, find the folder 5.2b, Deep Learning Part 2, look for DL Topics Connections subfolder, and I have an autoencoder with solution. And just as an example, I have the MNIST with sequential and functional API model statement. So that's not something I'm going to present, but I just wanted to have that in the folder in case you want to look at that code. Okay, so I'm going to open up the autoencoder. So go ahead and take a look at the open up the autoencoder. I'm just going to review it real quickly, and then let you guys work on the exercise. So again, this is an autoencoder for MNIST. What I've done here is I've added noise. So I've made it a harder problem. And the goal of this is to reconstruct the input images from noisy input. Okay, so my first set, I have some import statements. I prepare a data set. This is the same thing I did before. Here I have an add noise function. It's basically adding uniform noise, and you'll see what that looks like. The model that we're making is going to be, again, it's going to be a UNet model. It does an encoding, bottleneck, and then a decoding with upsampling. And we're going to start with some input. The input's going to be noisy, so it's not going to look like this. It's going to be reconstructed. And let's look at this encoder block. So I've split up my coding functions a little bit. So my encoder block is a convolution. It's a little block. Convolution followed by max pooling, another convolution followed by another max pooling. So this is the encoding But what's relevant for us, or what's maybe a little bit different, is I'm returning not just the last layer of max pooling, I'm returning the previous convolution layers. So take a look at that code. There's a bottleneck function to create the bottleneck layer. I have a decoder without concatenation. So what you want to do is you'll be able to run this, I think, without changing anything. And the decoder has blocks of a convolution, then an upsample, followed by another convolution and another upsample. And then a third convolution where I just have one filter with the kernel size. The activation is a sigmoid. So this last convolution layer is actually transforming everything into a 28 by 28 by 1 output. Okay, so the training is actually going to be applied to that final map. So I have those subfunctions. Convolution autoencoder is going to put those together, and notice that here, let's see. Okay, so there's my model statement, and the model statement says, put together these inputs and those outputs and make a model out of it. And the model statement can go and just build up from these subfunctions. Okay, so take a look at that. You can actually go ahead and run this without changing anything, and then before you start though, I have these statements in here. What you're going to want to do is go to look up the documentation for concatenate, and you're going to add a concatenate statement here, and we're going to use a skip concatenate. I called it skip concatenate 1. It's going to build a concatenation, and that's going to feed into the next layer. So you're going to want to concatenate. You got to make sure so now notice in the decoder, you have inputs, and you also are going to pass into it the convolutional output from the encoder. So that's what these two parameters are into this argument. So those are the things you're going to want to use when you build up this skip concatenation. So take a few minutes. I'm going to give you just one more little bit of information. It turns out when you go into Keras and look at concatenation, there's 2 concatenation functions. One of them is a capital C, and one of them is a small c. Okay, so just be clear, if you go and do a search on concatenate, you'll come across the ones with a small c as well. So you just want to be clear about that. It's a little bit confusing. It's one of those quirks of Keras, I think. Like they have a capital C concatenate where it's like a functional definition, and then a small c concatenate where you actually put the parameters inside the first parentheses. So why that, I'm not quite sure why that's there, but it's there. All right, but as I said, before you do it, go ahead and run everything. I'm going to go ahead and run it as it is. Okay, so I got some warning here, but oh, because it's not on a GPU device. But as you can see, it's running. The problem is small. Again, the problem is small enough to run on a CPU, no problem. Okay, so I just ran this for 20 epochs. The validation loss looks like it was still going down, so it probably could have ran for more. I have some functions to help me display the input and the output predictions. That's what these are. That's what's going on in here. And it looks something like this. So this is an example of my input images. They're pretty noisy. You could probably look at these and take a guess what the original images look like. And these are the predicted images. I'm sorry, the reconstructed images down here. So from the reconstructed images, hopefully you're getting close to this point. You can see that some of them do pretty well, some of them are not so well. Okay, and if you get to run it, you look at the performance and then go back and add the skip connections. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes. We'll give everyone 5 minutes, and then we'll do it together. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can fill in the statements to add skip connections. Okay, so I'm going to use this concatenate function, and let's see. I think I'm concatenating along axis 2 because the height and width are going to be the same, but I'm just essentially bringing along the features from some previous layer. So I'm going to concatenate the upsample 1 convolution with the encoding convolution 1 layer or output that was given into this decoder function. And then my convolution 2 statement, instead of using upsample 1, it has to use skip concatenation 1. There's an underscore there. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind is matching up the right sizes. So this, I think this is going to give me an error, but I'm going to go ahead and use it. I'm not going to add the other convolution, the other concatenation yet. What I'm going to do, just to get a, let's see. Just for debugging purposes, I'm going to add a couple print statements on the shape. Let's see, did I do this right? Okay. Okay. I got an error because the shapes are not quite right, I think. So the first shape is 14 by 14. The second shape was 28 by 28. What happened? Well, let me find those code, that code again. In the picture, remember, convolution 1 was 28 by 20. It's convolution 2 that downsamples to a 14 by 14. So when I go to my decoding function and I say I want to do a concatenation, the first concatenation has to be the first upsampling and the second convolution layer. So it's in reverse. Hopefully that makes sense. It can be a little bit confusing, but if you work through the shapes in the model summary, you will see that it makes sense. And then this has to be the second concatenation has to use the second upsampling with the first convolution layer. And now that has to be the input into my last convolution layer. Yep, there it is. Okay. Now it builds a model. I have the model summary. Again, the model summary is very useful to go and look at these shapes, see how big and small your bottlenecks are, your downsizing, your max pooling. If we look at the concatenation, so here is the second concatenation. Notice, oh, look what it did. That doesn't look right, does it? You see what happened? Does everyone see? Hopefully this is a little bit clearer. So my second concatenation took my, let's go to the first concatenation. This is where it first messed up. So my first concatenation, I have 14 by 14 by 128 is the upsampling that was there. And I was combining that with the 14 by 14 images from the encoding layers. So I should end up with 14 by 14 height and width by, instead of to 128, that should be 256. So look, so it concatenated it into the wrong spot. What did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? Let's see. I used axis equals 2. I think I want axis equals 3. So let's run that, and that. Now, now my concatenation, so there's the bottleneck. This first concatenation is now 14 by 14 by 256. And I have 14 by 14, 64, a convolution layer. Then there's an upsampling and the concatenation. And boom, my final output layer. All right, so now we can go ahead and test it out. All right, so this is going to take a few minutes to run and display results. I'm just going to wait right here. Hopefully you guys see, you get a feel for what it's like when you're coding with Keras. You're looking at the APIs, you're saying, oh, I need these options here, these options here. Getting those shapes right. I don't want to say it's tricky, but that to me is like the one thing where it's so easy to make a mistake and not realize it. I was recently doing a project where I was building a custom loss function. So Keras has a loss function that, a set of loss functions that are standard, and you can build your own loss function and pass it into the as part of the model compile step. And I was taking tensors, the TensorFlow variables, and multiplying them together, and it kept producing, instead of, I had an n by 1 times a 1 by n, and because it wasn't fully specified, it was like an n comma. Python has these kinds of shapes where it doesn't have the last dimension, so it was an n by 1. It was treated an n comma shape as n by 1, basically. I'm sorry, I think I have it backwards. I had a 1 by n and a 1 comma, or just an n vector, and made it a 1 by n, and it was giving me an outer product instead of an element-wise product between two vectors. So I ended up having these results that were almost sensible, and luckily, there was one thing that was quirky about my results, and I was able to track down that, oh, I just had to add a dimension to this tensor so that it would treat an n by 1 times an n by 1 with an element-wise multiplication. Anyway, that's a long way of saying, some of these tensors, it's the shapes you have to sometimes be careful of. Okay, so this is still running, I think. Let's see, where's it at? Oh, okay, here we go. All right, so this is the reconstruction. I think you'll see that the reconstruction looks better than it did before without the skip connections. Let's see, what is the error here? The validation loss is, you know what? I didn't remember what it was in the previous execution, but here it's, I think it's lower than it was before. And I would say definitely this one is better than it was before. I'm pretty sure this is a 1. And there's a little dot there that suggests it's maybe a funny 7. A couple of these were very hard to to guess what they were before without the skip connections. Hopefully you're getting that same kind of result. So adding the skip connections, again, the intuition is that you're able to reuse some of these lower level features to properly reconstruct this output. And again, as I mentioned, this UNet is used not for just reconstruction, but image segmentation, and I don't remember the other ones. It's used in different kinds of situations where you're reproducing an image. Okay, so your last convolution layer, your last layer is actually like, you know, it's going to have, basically it has, in this example, 28 by 28 output units. And each output unit is producing some error. Okay. Any questions on that? Let me give a second for questions to come back in. I think I'm done with the slides. Let me make sure that's the case. Yep. Oh, okay. See, I did this before. I kept track of the loss. All right. Are there any other questions? Let's see. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. I did want to. So earlier there was a slide that Mai talked about this transformer. And oops. Sorry about that. Hang on. Where'd it go? So in the transformer, you remember we were talking about this attention mechanism. I was telling you about how the attention mechanism was in fact doing a softmax. But in the transformer, not only are they doing a softmax, but they're also doing these skip connections. So you'll see this. I mean, this is what, you know, it makes the model is kind of complicated when you look at it this way. If you break it down, then it becomes more understandable. You see there's this attention mechanism. Inside that attention mechanism is this, you know, there's this gating going on to see what's relevant. And then beyond that, there is this skip connection. And in this case, they're doing a skip with an add, and there's doing some normalization as well. So, you know, these complicated networks are kind of taking some of these, you know, I think ideas that by themselves are not too bad, but they're combining them because they just keep adding, you know, layers and more kinds of transformations that they're looking for. So they're really guiding, this architecture is like guiding the network into solving this kind of problem. So that's how I think these things get built up. I think whoever, you know, there's probably some trial and error going on. In fact, I'm sure there is when people are working out these bigger models. Okay, so that is the last thing I want to say. Again, you know, we could go down a path of a lot more different kinds of architectural things people do, but hopefully this gives you a flavor for you know, some of those elements.